In the spring of 1942, across the windswept mountains of Persia, a most peculiar military convoy made its way through the ancient landscape. Among the thousands of weathered Polish soldiers, their uniforms still bearing the dust of Soviet labor camps, traveled an unlikely recruit. He was not quite 2 months old, weighed perhaps 20 pounds, and possessed a coat of thick brown fur. His name was Wojtek, and before this terrible war would end, he would become a corporal in the Polish army and help break one of the most formidable defensive lines in all of Europe. Before we go on, a small pledge that echoes the heart of this story. For the soldiers in our tale, the war was a brutal and visible conflict, an odyssey etched into history. Yet for too many veterans who make it home, the fight does not end on the battlefield. They return to face quiet battles, unseen struggles where help, tragically, often arrives late. It is a different kind of conflict, an echo of the war that I choose to answer. For every soul who pauses to watch any video on this channel, including this one, I set aside 1/10 of a cent. I donate the full amount once a year on Independence Day to support veterans in need. On that day, I upload an itemized public ledger in the Independence Day video that shows the viewer total, the money set aside, the recipients, and proof of donation. This pledge is personal and does not depend on platform payouts. By choosing to watch here, you already make a small, quiet, practical difference. Our story begins far from Persia, in the frozen expanse of the Soviet Union. It begins in the camps of the Gulag, where hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens languished after the dual invasion of their homeland in September 1939. When Hitler's Wehrmacht crashed across the Polish border on the 1st of September, the world watched in horror. But when Stalin's Red Army poured across Poland's eastern frontier just 16 days later, the nation found itself crushed between two totalitarian powers. The Nazi-Soviet pact had sealed Poland's fate. What followed was a calculated destruction of Polish society. The Soviets alone deported upwards of 325,000 Polish citizens, though some estimates place the number far, far higher, to the depths of Siberia and Central Asia. Officers, intellectuals, professionals, and common soldiers alike found themselves packed into cattle cars and sent to labor camps where temperatures plunged to 50 degrees below zero, where food consisted of watery soup and scraps of bread, where death from starvation, disease, and exposure claimed thousands. This was not imprisonment. It was an attempt to erase a people. In this frozen hell, hope was a dangerous illusion. Families were torn apart, their identities stripped, their future a void. The conflict here was not one of bullets, but of survival against nature, against hunger, and against the crushing apathy of their captors. Every sunrise was a victory, every meager ration a feast. The human spirit was stretched to its breaking point. Men watched their wives and children freeze. They buried their comrades in the frozen earth with their bare hands. They forgot what it felt like to be warm, to be full, to be human. Among those prisoners was a cavalry officer named Władysław Anders. Before the war, General Anders had been a decorated soldier, educated at the French Military Academy, a veteran of the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. Now he found himself in the most notorious prison in Moscow, the Lubyanka, the internal prison of the NKVD. He was subjected to brutal interrogations, beaten, starved, repeatedly pressured to betray his country and join the Red Army. For nearly 2 years, Anders endured this living nightmare, never knowing if he would see another sunrise. His survival was a testament to a will that the Soviets could not break, a stubborn refusal to surrender the idea of Poland. Then, on June 22, 1941, history pivoted on its axis. Hitler, in his ultimate act of hubris, betrayed Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. 3 million German soldiers crashed into Soviet territory. Suddenly, Stalin, the pariah, needed allies. This event brought a grim reprieve to their immediate crisis. The British government, now standing alongside the Soviets against Nazi Germany, pressed Stalin to release the Polish prisoners and allow them to form an army. On July 30th, 1941, the Sikorsky-Mayski Agreement was signed in London. It was a deal with the devil, but it was the only deal available. The Soviets agreed to grant a so-called amnesty to Polish prisoners and permit the formation of Polish armed forces on Soviet soil. On August 4, 1941, Władysław Anders walked out of Lubyanka prison. He was gaunt, a shadow of his former self, weakened by months of torture and deprivation, but his spirit remained unbroken. Within days, Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski, leading the Polish government in exile, appointed Anders to command this new army. It would be called the Polish Armed Forces in the East, though history would remember it by a simpler name known as Anders' Army. From that moment, the work truly began. The task before Anders was monumental, almost biblical in its scope. A call went out across the vast Soviet interior, and from camps scattered across thousands of miles, the Polish prisoners began to emerge. They came from the Kolyma in Siberia, from the steppes of Kazakhstan, from the deserts of Uzbekistan. They stumbled into recruitment centers in rags, their bodies ravaged by typhus, dysentery, and malnutrition. They were skeletons animated by a single burning desire to fight the Germans and to free Poland. Some died within days of reaching assembly points such as Buzuluk, Totskoye, and Tatishchevo, because their bodies were too broken to recover. What followed seemed calmer on the surface, yet it was only a hard kind of waiting between captivity and the road west. Yet beneath that progress a sickening problem surfaced. By the end of 1941, 25,000 soldiers had been assembled, forming the 5th, 6th, and 7th Infantry Divisions. But there was a mystery that haunted every roll call, a sickening silence. Where were the officers? Thousands of Polish officers, captured by the Soviets in 1939, were missing, and when Anders demanded answers from Soviet authorities, he received only silence and evasion. Stalin himself blandly suggested to Anders that perhaps they had escaped to Manchuria. This mystery would hang over the army like a shroud. It would not be until April 1943 that the world would learn the horrible truth. Those officers, the cream of Poland's military and intellectual class, had been murdered by the Soviet secret police in the spring of 1940. They were shot in the back of the head, one by one, in the forests of Katyn and other sites. Approximately 22,000 Polish military and police officers were executed in cold blood, their bodies buried in mass graves at Katyn and other sites. The Katyn massacre had robbed Poland of an entire generation of leadership. This was the amnesty Stalin had offered. And there was another conflict, more immediate, more visceral: starvation. By early 1942, Anders' army numbered over 40,000, but conditions in the Soviet Union were deteriorating rapidly. The Soviets, reeling from German advances, could not, or would not, provide adequate rations. The Polish soldiers were sharing their meager food supplies with an ever-growing number of Polish civilians, including women and children, who had also been released from the camps and had flocked to the army for protection. People were dying of hunger and disease after their release. Typhus swept through the camps, killing thousands. Anders made a decision. He would evacuate his army from Soviet territory. He would lead his people out of this land of death. Through British mediation, Stalin agreed on March 18, 1942, to allow the evacuation. For the first time in months, a way out appeared. The soldiers and civilians would travel across the Caspian Sea to Persia, which had been occupied by British and Soviet forces the previous year to secure its oil fields and supply routes. The journey was arduous. From locations across Soviet Central Asia, the Poles made their way to the port of Krasnovodsk on the Caspian Sea. Some traveled by train, packed into cars just as they had been when sent to the Gulag. Others walked hundreds of miles. The evacuation took place in 2 waves, one in March and April, another in August. When it was complete, approximately 115,000 people had reached Persian soil. Among them were about 78,000 soldiers and 37,000 civilians, including 18,000 children. They had escaped the Soviet nightmare, but they were still far from home, stateless refugees. It was during this great exodus somewhere in the mountains near the city of Hamadan in western Persia that a new life began. A small group of Polish soldiers traveling by truck encountered a young Iranian boy at a train station. The boy carried with him a burlap sack, and inside that sack was a whimpering, tiny Syrian brown bear cub whose mother had been killed by hunters. The soldiers, their hearts perhaps softened by thoughts of their own children left behind in occupied Poland, were captivated by the tiny orphaned creature. These men had seen humanity at its absolute worst. They had seen death and cruelty as a daily diet. And now they were confronted by this small, innocent life. The exact details of the transaction vary slightly depending on which veteran told the story in later years, but the essence remains consistent. The bear was purchased for a handful of items that included some Persian coins, a Swiss Army knife, a tin of corned beef, and a bar of chocolate. These were treasures to a young shepherd boy in wartime Persia. To the Polish soldiers, the cub represented something more profound. He was innocent, helpless, in need of protection, just as they had been. Perhaps in caring for this small animal, they could reclaim some small measure of the humanity that war and the Gulag had tried to strip away. For a brief moment, kindness cut through the brutality. A different life took shape for Wojtek. The cub was initially given into the care of an 18-year-old civilian refugee named Irina Bokiewicz, who had also escaped from the Soviet Union with the army. For 3 months, the young bear lived in a Polish refugee camp near Tehran. Irina and the soldiers fed him condensed milk from an empty vodka bottle, using a twisted cloth as a makeshift teat. The cub had difficulty swallowing at first, but slowly he grew stronger. He was eventually donated to the 22nd Transport Company, later redesignated the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, and given a name that would become legend. They called him Wojtek, a diminutive of the Polish name Wojciech, meaning happy warrior or joyful warrior. It was a name that would prove prophetic. As Wojtek grew, so did his appetite and his personality. The soldiers, now stationed in the Middle East, moving through Iraq, Palestine, and Egypt, treated him not as a pet, but as one of their own. He was a buffer against the trauma they had endured. They fed him fruit, marmalade, honey, and syrup. As he matured, they discovered he had developed quite a taste for beer, which he would drink from a bottle, tilting his head back like any soldier, and when the bottle was empty, he would peer through the opening as if wondering where the rest had gone. The men found this endlessly amusing. He also developed a habit that astonished everyone who witnessed it. Wojtek would accept lit cigarettes from the soldiers, take a puff, and then swallow the cigarette whole. Whether he truly enjoyed smoking or was simply mimicking the behavior of his human companions remains a matter of debate, but the sight of a bear smoking a cigarette became one of the most memorable images associated with the 22nd Company. Wojtek was not merely a mascot. He became a companion, a friend, a source of joy in a world consumed by darkness. The soldiers had lost so much. Their country was occupied, their families scattered or worse. Many had endured years in Soviet camps where they had witnessed unspeakable cruelty. Now, in the deserts and mountains of the Middle East, far from home, this bear brought laughter back into their lives. He would wrestle with the soldiers, play with them, his massive paws gentle, his jaws careful never to break the skin. He learned to salute when greeted by an officer. He would ride in the front seats of military trucks with his head out the window, his ears flapping in the wind, startling passers-by who could scarcely believe their eyes. He had a particular fondness for cold showers and eventually learned to turn on the shower tap by himself. This led to a small, humorous conflict. When his profligate use of water created shortages in the camp, his comrades forbade him from showering alone, posting a guard at the shower tent. But rules meant little to Wojtek. One day, finding the shower door open, he wandered inside and encountered a local man who had sneaked into the Polish camp apparently seeking information about the location of the weapons arsenal, so that local dissidents might raid it. The terrified interloper, confronted by a bear in an enclosed space, surrendered immediately to the Poles. As a reward for this inadvertent act of security, the reward was simple. Wojtek earned himself unlimited shower privileges and 2 bottles of beer. He had, in his own way, become a soldier, a guard of the camp. Those months in the Middle East prepared them for the next ordeal. The army was healing. They were being equipped by the British, trained in modern warfare. From Persia, the Polish forces moved through Iraq to Palestine and finally to Egypt. By late 1943, the Polish forces in the Middle East had been reorganized and expanded. The Polish Second Corps was formally established on July 21, 1943, under the command of General Anders. The Second Corps comprised approximately 50,000 men, organized into 2 infantry divisions, the 3rd Carpathian Infantry Division and the 5th Kresowa Infantry Division, along with supporting armored and artillery units. They were now part of the British 8th Army, the legendary desert force that had defeated Rommel at El Alamein and was now fighting its way up the Italian peninsula. In early 1944, orders came down. The Polish Second Corps would be transferred to Italy to join the Italian campaign. Then came a snag born of paperwork. There was only one problem. British military regulations, set down by commanders in distant Cairo, strictly forbade mascot and pet animals from boarding transport ships. The soldiers of the 22nd Company were devastated. They had already lost their homeland. They had survived the Gulag. They had marched halfway across Asia. They would not abandon Wojtek. This bear was not a pet. He was their brother. He was the symbol of their company. Leaving him behind was unthinkable. The men argued with their superiors. They hid Wojtek during inspections. But a 500-pound bear is not easy to hide. The conflict reached a breaking point at the port of Alexandria. A British transport officer, a stickler for the rules, stood at the gangplank and flatly refused to let the bear embark. Someone, and history has not recorded exactly who first suggested it, came up with an ingenious solution, a solution born of battlefield logic and sheer Polish stubbornness. If Wojtek could not travel as a pet, he would travel as a soldier. And so, Wojtek was officially drafted into the Polish army. He was given the rank of private, assigned a serial number, and issued a paybook. He was listed on the company roster as a soldier of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company with his own rations and pay. With these official documents, the British port authorities in Alexandria could not deny him passage. The befuddled officer checked his clipboards, saw the name, and waved him through. His caretakers made him a special wooden crate for sleeping, though Wojtek, as usual, preferred to sleep with the men in their quarters, his bulk a warm and comforting presence during the crossing of the Mediterranean. The Polish Second Corps arrived in Italy during December 1943 and January 1944. Italy was a new theater of war, and it was brutal. What they found there was not a rapid liberation, but a grinding, brutal stalemate. The Allies had invaded Italy in September 1943, expecting a quick advance toward Rome. Instead, they had been stopped cold by a series of German defensive lines that took brilliant advantage of Italy's mountainous terrain. The most formidable of these was the Gustav Line, anchored by a nearly impregnable position known as Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino was not merely a military objective. It was a symbol. It was a monastery that had stood for 1,400 years atop a 1,700-foot mountain. The monastery had been founded by Saint Benedict himself in the year 529. For centuries, it had been a center of learning, art, and faith, a beacon of Western civilization. Now it guarded Highway 6, the main route to Rome. The Germans, specifically their elite 1st Parachute Division, the Fallschirmjäger, had fortified the mountain and the surrounding hills with bunkers, machine gun nests, barbed wire, and minefields. Below the mountain lay the town of Cassino, itself transformed into a fortress. Between January and May 1944, the Allies launched 3 major assaults against Monte Cassino. It became the crucible of the Italian campaign. The first battle in January saw the American 36th Division attempt to cross the Rapido River, a costly failure that resulted in thousands of casualties. The second battle, in February, saw New Zealand and Indian troops gain a foothold in the town but fail to take the monastery. It was during this phase, on February 15, 1944, that one of the war's most controversial decisions was made. Allied bombers, mistakenly believing the Germans were using the monastery as an observation post, dropped over 1,000 tons of explosives on the ancient structure, reducing it to rubble. The Germans, who had previously agreed not to use the monastery for military purposes, immediately moved into the ruins and used the twisted stone in ancient cellars as defensive positions. The bombing, intended to save lives, had made the position even stronger. The third battle in March was another failed attempt, another river of blood soaking into the Italian soil. The casualties were staggering. 55,000 Allied soldiers would ultimately fall in the Monte Cassino campaign. The mountain had become a graveyard. It had broken the Americans, the British, the New Zealanders, and the Indians. The morale of the Allied armies was at its nadir. The hour was desperate. In March 1944, General Oliver Leese, commander of the British Eighth Army, met with General Anders. The Allies were planning a fourth assault, a massive coordinated offensive codenamed Operation Diadem, involving 20 divisions along a 20-mile front. Leese offered Anders and the Polish Second Corps the most difficult and most symbolic mission of all, which was the capture of Monte Cassino itself. It was an unenviable task. It was a mission some considered suicidal. The mountain had already broken 3 Allied assaults. Anders could refuse if he felt his men were not ready. Anders consulted with his chief of staff. They spoke briefly, and then Anders accepted. He understood precisely what this battle would cost. He also understood what it could mean. Poland was at that very moment being liberated by the Red Army, and the Soviets were already installing a communist puppet government. A Polish victory at Monte Cassino, one of the most famous and difficult battlefields in the world, would remind the Western Allies, would remind Roosevelt and Churchill that Poland was still fighting, still bleeding for freedom, and still deserving of support and independence. This was not just a battle for a hill, it was a battle for Poland's soul. On May 11, 1944, at 11 o'clock in the evening, over 1,600 Allied artillery pieces opened fire. The earth shook. The sky turned orange. The roar was unceasing, a physical weight that crushed the air. At 1:30 in the morning on May 12th, the Polish soldiers went forward. The 3rd Carpathian Division attacked Hill 593, known as Calvary Hill and Phantom Ridge. The 5th Kresoa Division struck toward Colle Sant'Angelo. The fighting, the central conflict of their war, was savage beyond description. The Germans had established overlapping fields of fire. Every meter of ground was registered for artillery and mortars. The Poles advanced through minefields, across tangled barbed wire, under withering machine gun fire from positions they could not see. The Fallschirmjäger were masters of defense, and they fought with a tenacity born of fanaticism. By dawn, half the attacking force had been killed or wounded. Anders ordered a withdrawal to regroup. For 5 days, the battle raged. The Poles took one position, then another, then were driven back by furious counterattacks, then attacked again. The slopes of Monte Cassino became littered with Polish dead. The survivors pressed on, driven by something more than military orders. They were fighting for the honor of Poland, for the memory of their murdered officers at Katyn, for their families suffering under occupation, for a homeland most of them would never see again. The terrain was a moonscape, pockmarked by shells, the air thick with cordite and the smell of death. Men fought hand-to-hand in the ruins with bayonets and grenades. And through it all, up and down the narrow, treacherous mountain roads, carrying supplies to the artillery positions, was Wojtek. This is the part of the story that some historians have questioned, but multiple eyewitness accounts, including testimony from British soldiers who saw him, confirm what happened. Wojtek, now fully grown and weighing close to 500 pounds, helped his company move ammunition. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company's job was vital. They had to transport ammunition from supply dumps to the artillery batteries that were firing constantly on the German positions. The roads were under constant observation and intermittent fire. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Wojtek watched the soldiers as they carried heavy wooden crates containing 25-pound artillery shells. Each crate weighed approximately 100 pounds. And Wojtek, imitating the men he had grown up with, began to help. Soldiers reported seeing the bear walking upright on his hind legs, which he often did, carrying ammunition crates or heavy shells in his powerful forelimbs. He moved from the supply trucks to the artillery positions, stacking the ammunition. He never dropped a single crate. He was apparently unfazed by the noise of the explosions and the chaos of the battle. The sight of him, this massive animal calmly doing the work of a soldier, was an incredible boost to the morale of the exhausted Poles. He became their living banner. Whether he understood the importance of what he was doing, whether he simply wanted to help his friends, or whether he was motivated by the treats and praise he received, we cannot know. But the image of a bear, a creature of the wild, calmly carrying ammunition under fire, became one of the most enduring and morale-boosting symbols of the Battle of Monte Cassino. He was the happy warrior, doing his part. On May 17th, the Poles launched their final assault. The British 13th Corps, fighting in the Leary Valley below, had finally broken through the main Gustav line, threatening to cut off the German defenders on the mountain. That night, under cover of a fierce counterattack, the elite German 1st Parachute Division, having fought to the point of annihilation, began to evacuate Monte Cassino. At dawn on May 18, 1944, a patrol from the 12th Podolsky Lancers picked their way through the shattered ruins of the monastery. For the first time in months, the mountain fell silent. They found 30 wounded German soldiers and a few medical personnel. The patrol raised a makeshift regimental pennant. And then, in one of the war's most poignant moments, they raised the red and white flag of Poland over the ruins of Monte Cassino. A bugler played the Hejnał Mariaki, the traditional bugle call of Krakow, a call that is always cut short, symbolizing a watchman's death. On this day, it was not cut short. It was played in full. After 4 months of brutal battle, after 55,000 Allied casualties, the mountain had fallen. The road to Rome was open. The price was paid in blood. The Polish losses were grievous: 924 killed or died of wounds, 2,930 wounded, 345 missing. For his service at Monte Cassino, Private Wojtek was promoted to the rank of corporal. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company, in honor of their most famous soldier, changed its official emblem to an image of a bear carrying an artillery shell. This insignia was painted on their vehicles, worn on their uniforms, and would become one of the most recognizable symbols of the Polish forces in World War II. Monte Cassino had been won, yet the war did not end. Another beginning was already underway. The Polish Second Corps continued fighting its way up the Italian peninsula. They captured the strategic port of Ancona on the Adriatic, a victory that was entirely their own. They fought through the Gothic Line. They took Bologna in April 1945, their final battle of the war. Wojtek was with them through it all. He was a veteran now, a seasoned soldier, as much a part of the company as any man. After the war ended in May 1945, the Polish Second Corps found itself in a new and deeply cruel conflict. This conflict was political, a betrayal that cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Poland had been liberated from Nazi occupation, but it was now under total Soviet domination. The Yalta Conference had sealed their fate, trading their freedom for a flawed peace. The communist government installed by Stalin declared General Anders and many of his officers traitors. On September 26, 1946, Anders, the man who had led them from the Gulag, was stripped of his Polish citizenship. Most of his soldiers, knowing they would face persecution, imprisonment, or execution if they returned, chose to remain in exile. They were heroes without a home. They had fought for a free Poland only to find that their home was no longer theirs. This was perhaps the bitterest conflict of all, a victory that tasted of ash. In October 1946, the 22nd Company, as part of the demobilization of the Second Corps, was transferred to Scotland. They were stationed at Winfield Airfield near the village of Hutton in Berwickshire. For a time, life slowed into a quiet interlude far from the front. Wojtek came with them. The local Scottish residents, who had endured years of war, were astonished and delighted by the sight of a massive brown bear wrestling with soldiers, drinking beer, and riding in trucks. Children would take turns sitting on his back. Wojtek attended dances with the soldiers, often consuming bottles of beer and smoking cigarettes, a local celebrity in a quiet corner of the world. He had a favorite tree that he loved to climb, and the scratch marks he left on that tree remained visible for decades, a physical reminder of his time there. He was, for a short while, at peace among his friends in a land that was not his own, just as they were. But this peaceful life could not last. A final, heartbreaking conflict loomed. The soldiers were being demobilized. They were returning to civilian life, scattering across Britain, Canada, and other countries to build new lives from the ashes of the old. A decision had to be made about Wojtek. He had been raised by humans his entire life. He had never known the wild. He could not survive on his own. The soldiers, his brothers in arms, in perhaps the most painful decision they had to make, agreed to give Wojtek to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he could live out his days in safety and comfort. It was the end of the 22nd Company. It was the end of their family. On November 15, 1947, Corporal Wojtek, veteran of the Italian campaign, hero of Monte Cassino, entered Edinburgh Zoo. Peace arrived, though it came with bars. It was a life of peace, but also a life of captivity. Former Polish soldiers, many of whom had settled in and around Edinburgh, would visit him regularly. They would climb over the barriers, much to the alarm of the zookeepers, to embrace him. They would toss cigarettes for him to eat, bring him bottles of beer, and, most importantly, speak to him in Polish. Witnesses reported that when Wojtek heard the familiar sounds of the Polish language, he would become animated, standing on his hind legs, waving his paws, reaching toward the visitors as if trying to rejoin them, to return to the column. He never forgot his friends. He never forgot who he was. Corporal Wojtek died on December 2, 1963. He was 21 years old, weighed about 230 kilograms, which is about 500 pounds, and stood a little over 6 feet tall when upright. He had lived half his life as a soldier and half his life in a zoo. Which half was better, we cannot say. The story of Wojtek could have ended there, a curious footnote in the history of World War II. But something remarkable happened. People did not forget. Veterans told their children and grandchildren about the bear who fought alongside them. Journalists wrote articles. Books were published. And the memorials began to appear, a final, permanent resolution to his legacy. In 2013, the City Council of Krakow approved the erection of a statue of Wojtek in the city's Jordan Park. It was unveiled on May 18, 2014, the 70th anniversary of the capture of Monte Cassino. In 2015, Edinburgh, his final home, erected a bronze statue in West Princes Street Gardens, showing Wojtek walking alongside a Polish soldier bearing the words, "In memory of the Polish men and women who fought for your freedom and ours." There are statues in Cassino, Italy, where the battle was fought, in London at the Sikorsky Museum, in Canada, in Poland. Wherever Polish veterans settled, Wojtek's story traveled with them. Why does this story endure? Why does a bear matter when we remember a war that claimed 60 million human lives? Perhaps because Wojtek represents something that war tries to destroy but can never fully extinguish. He represents the capacity for kindness in the midst of cruelty, for joy in the midst of sorrow, for loyalty when everything else has been stripped away. The soldiers who adopted Wojtek in the mountains of Persia had every reason to be bitter, angry, hardened beyond redemption. They had been imprisoned, starved, tortured. They had watched comrades die in frozen camps. They were fighting for a country that many of them would never see free in their lifetimes. And yet, when they found an orphaned bear cub, they chose compassion. They shared their meager rations. They protected him. They loved him. And in return, Wojtek gave them something precious. He made them laugh. He reminded them of home. He gave them a reason to hope that goodness still existed somewhere in this broken world. General Władysław Anders lived in exile until his death on May 12, 1970, exactly 26 years to the day after his soldiers first attacked Monte Cassino. True to his final wishes, he was buried among his men at the Polish War Cemetery on the slopes of Monte Cassino, where the red poppies bloom every spring among the white headstones. He never returned to the Poland he had fought for, but he never stopped fighting for Polish freedom. The men of the Polish Second Corps, wherever they settled, carried with them the memory of what they had endured and what they had accomplished. They had survived the Gulag. They had marched across continents. They had broken the Gustav Line. And they had served alongside a bear named Wojtek, who, for a brief moment in history, showed the world that even in the darkest times, there is still room for tenderness, for friendship, for love. Today, more than 80 years after a young bear cub was traded for a chocolate bar and a pocket knife in the mountains of Persia, Wojtek's story continues to inspire. It reminds us that history is not just made by generals and politicians, by tanks and artillery, by grand strategies and political agreements. History is also made by ordinary people who choose kindness when cruelty would be easier, who choose to care for the helpless when they themselves are barely surviving, who choose to remain human when the world around them has become inhuman. Corporal Wojtek, soldier bear of the Polish Second Corps, stands now in bronze and stone in parks and public squares across the world. Children touch his statue and ask their parents to tell the story again. Veterans, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, still gather at the memorials on May 18th to remember the friends they lost and the unlikely comrade who stood with them on the slopes of Monte Cassino. This was his war. This was his service. This was how an orphaned bear cub became a soldier, how a soldier became a corporal, and how a corporal became a legend that will endure as long as people remember that in the midst of mankind's worst war, there lived a bear who carried ammunition up a mountain and reminded an army of exiles what it meant to be brave, to be loyal, and to be loved.